that uh, this is being recorded on video, but it is actually, we're only going to focus on the audio for like the sharing out of it.
Okay.
So this is just so we can really see our, each other's faces and connect and that kind of thing. And also too, because the way Zoom works, you probably already know this, that like people can't really talk at the same time. So I like to do the video so that you can see that I am paying attention and I'll be nodding. I just won't be, chiming in with my yeah, girl,
Got you.
So anyway, one of the things that I'm trying to do with folks is just give them a little bit of insight into the project that might not have been clear in those initial emails.
Okay.
And the one thing is that, the term, the Futures Gallery, the idea of artist space as emergent response, the Futures Gallery, I feel like gallery, we need to clarify that we don't necessarily mean gallery in the traditional sense, but it's more of a placeholder. It was used in the initial grant proposal, but we realized that what we're trying to create and what the village is trying to do is much more expansive than I think the term gallery can hold. It's bigger than that container. Because, and if anything, I think it might be closer to a museum than a gallery, but of course not on that scale, but in its function, right? Because, the gallery space is not typically a space of education and gathering and healing and conflict resolution and all these things that I think the village is thinking that this space will be for the community, as their other spaces have been. They have all these outdoor gardens and healing spaces that have, just been at the core of what the village really is and has to offer. But I just wanted to make sure so that when you respond and you're thinking about your thoughts, you don't have to think about it in terms of just like a strict gallery space. That's for one.
Okay.
What else here? And also too, I think that this is an investigation of, people's thoughts and experiences and expertise when it comes to what they know of existing gallery spaces and museums and institutions. But it's also an opportunity for us to flex our imagination and to also think in this speculative way. Because we kind of have to. When we're thinking about a space for the future and the fact that the village has been around for 30 plus years and wants to be around for 30 plus more, what was happening 30 years ago in the art world? Yeah. It's very different than what's happening right now. And it's so different that we might not have been able to imagine it then. 30 years ago, we couldn't have imagined what we'd be dealing with now. And I think a part of that, it's the same way in this moment. Like, how are we going to really project what the future will be 30 years from now and what art spaces might look like or what they might need to be in order to provide and support the community in the ways that the village wants to. And so, all these things are what we're going to be thinking about. As you saw, there were like those core questions that I sent. They're really overarching, and really pretty broad. But everyone that I'm speaking to, I'm asking those general questions. But I think that the subset of questions is varying depending on who the interviewee is, what their interests are, what their kind of where they're coming from, But just to kind of get started, what we want to do is think about, give you an opportunity to share on the audio just who you are, maybe any titles that you wanted to share, where you're from and where you're hailing in from, where you're calling in from. And then I can feed you the rest of the questions, but also too, like maybe some bio information, any highlights of past projects, current projects, future projects. One I would love for you to mention is your work with the Futures Therapy Lab and what you were doing around that, Sure. Because I think that's definitely relevant, and anything else that I might not be aware of. But for starters, just, where your name, where you're from, and where you are now. and then I'll
Sure.
feed you the rest of the questions.
Sure. Thank you, Lee. So my name is Shivon Pearl Love, and I'm a Philadelphia resident. I'm a Philly native. I've lived here my entire life. Um, and my, how would I describe myself? Well, I guess first, first I am, I'm a community member, a member of a number of different communities here in Philadelphia. I am a mother to two children, one young child, 7 years old, and then an adult child who's 24 years old. And I'm a partner to Anya Buile, my husband. Um, and I work as an arts administrator. I work at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, aka the Art Museum, and
Right, the art museum.
yeah, the art museum, right, right. And I've been there about coming up on 4 years, and my current title is long, but even after I say it, it's not going to make any sense. So I'm gonna try my best to articulate
Yeah.
what that means, or at least what it means to me. So my current title is curator of education for community engagement and access, and I've only been in this particular role for about 6 months. Prior to that, I was the coordinator of community programs. Um, and this role is one that is still evolving. Even though I helped to shape the job description, I think because of the moment that we're in culturally, also institutionally, there is still a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty around what that means. But what the work means for me, and has always meant, as long as I've been at this particular institution, it has meant that I am a person who is a conduit, and a person who holds space. So as long as I am in this institution, I'm going to use the resources of this institution to serve my community and other communities to the best of my ability. And that looks different all the time. So sometimes it takes shape in the form of programs, um, making sure that we are bringing people in don't necessarily always have the opportunity to have a voice within the museum. And that looks different too, depending on what the circumstances are. But making sure that people are being paid for their work, making sure that there's a diversity of voices and perspectives that are being brought to whatever is happening. Lately, I've been doing a lot of interpretive work, working on um, how the artwork is being expressed to the public, and also just a lot of like internal work around inclusive hiring and things like that. So even though this particular moment, all institutions are scrambling to do the things that they should have done 50 years ago.
Right.
But this has always been at the core of the work that I have done. And before I came to the museum, I worked in a number of different nonprofits, ranging from community education, nutrition education, youth education, and so while some of the stuff that's happening, in the larger institutions and the more predominantly white um, institutions is, it's a moment.
Oh,
It's a
right.
moment in time. I think that these are things that folk like you and I just it's who we are, and it's embedded in the work that we do anyway. So it's been a really interesting moment being in these spaces.
Mhm.
um, Very frustrating moment being in these spaces, but again, as long as we're in them, I think that it's my responsibility to make it the best possible space for anyone that comes after me and anyone that is engaging with what's happening there, to the best of my ability.
I love that. And look, I think Dr. King is singing your praises right now on a day like today. Like that's right. We gotta think about folks that are coming after us 1,000%. Hold on one second, because my heater, even though it's cold,
Yeah,
I got my space heater on, it's making too much noise.
no, you're fine.
Just have to suck it up. Anyhow,
Um,
so yeah.
oh yeah, so but also outside of outside of my day job, you know,
Hmm.
there's my real life.
There's your real life.
um, and so I do have, and I'll come back to the museum and talk about Future
Yeah.
Therapy Lab in a minute. But you know, I mentioned that, you know, I worked in nutrition education, so I also focus. I guess I have a creative practice where I focus on the contributions of Black women, the cultural contributions rather of Black women. Um, Through food and language. So I am a co-founder of a project called Our Mother's Kitchens, which is a culinary and literature project that looks at how Black women use language and food to explore the Black lived experience. And that project has been ongoing since about 2016, but it's an extension of work that both I and my partner and co-founder Kalia had been doing prior to that, working with young people in Philly high schools,
Hmm.
um, teaching them about food and nutrition and culture and cultural continuity, and you know we were doing that working for an institution, another predominantly white institution,
Hmm.
but you know it was really difficult to to teach and to also connect with people in a way that felt authentic to who we were, felt authentic to our communities. So you know, after we left that job, we started Our Mother's Kitchens, and since 2016, we led an annual summer camp at Sankofa Community Farm at Bartram's Garden, um, and also had a series of community dinners that were in honor of several Black women authors. We've done a number of other things just to explore the way that Black women's relationships with one another, but also Black women's relationships to self-expression can be exhibited through food and can be exhibited through language.
Hmm.
So I try to infuse that those ideas into anything that I do, and that's actually oddly enough how I ended up working at the museum. Before I was actually on staff there, I participated in a project that was connected to the Philadelphia Assembled exhibit. So I was one of the culinary collaborators that worked on the Philadelphia Assembled kitchen,
Right.
and that particular project was, you know, 11 culinary artists or home cooks who all kind of like were responding to a call to action found in Entezaki Shange's "If I Can Cook, You Know God Can," where she asked, you know, we know what we know what you know politicians and we know what you know people in power do to celebrate their victories and their existence and their survival, but what do everyday folk do? So our responses to that were through food and were through programming and were through conversations and bringing some of our familial histories and things like that into that space. And you know, that was the that whole exhibit, that whole time was the blackest, and not even just black because it wasn't just Black folk, but I mean it was just um, the most, it felt the most like our city, right, than I've ever
Yeah.
seen the museum feel, even to
Yeah.
this day. So shortly after that, I started working for the museum. Um, and, you know, it's been this interesting thing of trying to like catch that feeling again. You
Yeah.
knowing that like even with that particular project, you know, it had a lot of like it was great, you know, and also it had a lot of challenges as well. But you know, in terms of an institution working with multiple communities across the city. But at the
Yeah.
same time, I feel like there's a lot of lessons that could be learned from that particular project. And I didn't work on it, you know, from the institutional side. I worked on it from an artistic side. So it's a, you know, I don't have all of the learnings and the information that I wish I did, but I feel like there's a lot to be taken from a project like that, which is not common for a place like the PMA, but it is the type of project that I feel like, you know, the village does on a regular basis.
Right. Right. I keep
So
saying. Hmm. Hmm.
yeah, and then the last thing I'll say, just to, since you mentioned it, to come
Yeah.
back to the Futures Therapy Lab. So that was that was a space within the museum that was connected to the designs for different futures exhibit. I think that was like 2019, if I'm not
Right.
mistaken.
I think
It was
I
like
think
so long ago. It
I
was,
know it was pre-pandemic,
yeah,
pre-corona.
it ran right up into the pandemic, smacked in the face by the pandemic.
Yeah, that's right.
But
Right.
that particular exhibit, and honestly, Lee, like even when I reached out to you about that, I was like, yeah, I'm gonna try to explain this to you to the best of my ability, but I don't really speak this language. you know,
Right.
it was
Right.
dealing with technology and the future in a number of different ways, and I was responsible for helping to conceptualize some programming around it. So
Mhm.
there was a space within the exhibit or adjacent to the exhibit called the Futures Therapy Lab, and there was all sorts of programming happening in
Yeah.
there. And the program that I was working on was just like a Sunday reading room where we invited different folks, not necessarily artists, just different folks that represented any number of backgrounds. And that's part of what I thought was the the beauty of it, is that
Yeah.
it gave the opportunity to really tap into all the different types of knowledge and information that is out there, right? So, you know,
Very diverse.
yeah, it was a nice group of folk, and we asked everyone. There was different themes that were all connected to different themes. So we asked folks to come and do a reading of a particular piece of literature that that was meaningful to them. So, we had folks like you come, you brought Carlo Campbell
Yeah.
from Theater in the X, and you read through some of your work and acted it out, which was really cool.
Yeah, we actually did excerpts from Blade Runner, which was
Oh,
cool because
shit.
yeah, it was exciting because I thought I was gonna do something from Graffiti in the Grass, but like it wasn't complete.
Mm,
So
mm,
we did Blade Runner, and I'm so excited because I think because of that inspiration, we're gonna do like the full on play, like the full a full theater production
oh my
inspired
God.
by that
Wow.
reading.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow. I would, that's really amazing. I would love to see
yeah.
that. We have folks talking about, the future of our food system. We have folks talking about intimacy, um, talking about like our interior lives. Like there were just so many different points that were pulled out of just that particular program,
Mhm.
that spanned about, I don't know, about 12 weeks or so. And it was really nice just to hear the different ways that people were approaching what they envision for our future. You know what I mean? And using literature as that kind of that grounding force. So yeah, I'm gonna stop talking there.
No, that's great. That's a great place to start. And you've already kind of like answered some of my other questions because one of the questions was kind of like, what brought you to the art world? So it sounds like, I
hmm
mean, prior to Philadelphia Assemble and the work that you did through the culinary practice, you know, had you already been in institutions of the arts before? So that was your first entree into that.
Mm, not at all, not at all.
Wow.
And I feel like this is appropriate to this conversation. So, one of the things that I explore, I guess personally, kind of with our mother's kitchens, but also just outside of my own research, is thinking about, what constitutes art,
Mhm.
or how we value or don't value different people's different contributions, right? So, for the work that we do around food, one of the things that we've really advocated for is that cooking and culinary practices are both art and ritual, right? And not just by some magic that, like, you're a black woman so you just know how to cook, because it's like not that, but it's just that the level of intention and the the ways in which there's a certain way that folks approach growing food, um, and then the harvesting of the food, and then the preparation of the food, and the intention that is around that. Like, it's not haphazard. It's not just something that, there's a way in which that many people, many cultures approach these types of things that I think gets dismissed or doesn't get considered for what it is and for how meaningful it can be, right? Um, and of course, there's a utilitarian, aspect to it, but also I think that we can learn so much about other aspects of ourselves and other aspects of various cultures. But my work specifically focuses on cultures of the African diaspora, right? And thinking about Black women in particular, but even just the communal practices that are around cooking, food preparation, etc., right? So I
Yeah.
think that when in thinking about Black women and thinking about Black women's labor and thinking about um, the minimization or minimization, that might you know
Yeah.
what I'm trying to get
I
at,
know what you're saying.
and you know, and the invisibility of labor, that can be applied in a number of different ways. So when I'm thinking about like what I know of the work that happens at the village, right, and the way that they're approaching art,
Mhm.
and approaching like how to consider, you know, what should happen next, right? It's thinking about like who's there, like who's
Mhm.
there, who should be a part of the conversation. And um, you know, I think it's a lot of times people that tend to get left out of the conversation,
Yeah.
when it comes to um to larger institutions. I mean, not just larger institutions, because I'm sure that could be applied to smaller institutions too. But
Yeah.
you know, so I think just thinking about our city, specifically, but not limiting um, the scope, because I think that it's really important to think about not just what's happening here in Philly, but what's also happening um, in other cities across the country. Because I think wherever you find Black folk, we are experiencing the same types of things, right? We are,
Right.
and they might be moving on a different timeline, but
Right.
I think, it's important to know what's happening with our folk wherever we may be. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because wherever we are, we're experiencing, we're struggling, we're loving, you know what I mean? We're experiencing joy. And it's important to connect those dots, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
not just here, like in the United States, but also like connecting to folks globally, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Around the world.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
The
So,
diaspora, and that's why like it feels that, like you're saying, like when you come back to that foundation of your culinary practice and work in the land and growing food, you know, it speaks to how that connects us across the diaspora. You know what I mean? Like the diaspora is something that has always been a connector for folks of color. And traditions and culture and food. And definitely food. So there's something cool. And I can't remember who said this to me, but they were like, there is no culture without agriculture.
mhm,
Um, and the idea of that, that really is our foundation. And I love that you have brought that. There's something about the pairing of that with the literary arts that you've
mhm,
done with your project. It's really beautiful. And I think that, there's, yeah, I mean, we can't help right now. So many urban farmers, especially the Black-led urban farms that are, really doing that work. Like they're most definitely thinking about the future, and that's almost their motivation. Like doing this work is really their way of sustaining and securing a future for our communities. So it's interesting how art is kind of seen in a similar way. Like this idea of even art and futurism, the way that these visions are our imaginations, like the power of that and what that means for Black people, like the ability to see ourselves in the future is really a part of our survival. And those two things, it's like, the food and the agriculture and the art, I love the way they work in such synergy within your practice and what you're doing with our mother's kitchens and with the work at the PMA, because as you were talking about maybe you said your title. It's a lot, but like the idea of community engagement and access, like access has always been an issue.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the reasons why it's really exciting to do these interviews with folks of color in the field, who have somehow, some way gained access. And a priority for all of them has been, how can I then open up doors and provide access for others, And I think that's on the forefront of the mind of the village, in terms of trying to think of how this space is going to function um, for the community, um, for their sustainability, into the future. But then also, you know, it's about this access, like one of the whole, like the design of this futures gallery is also about access and trying to keep things fluid, and dealing with a world that's constantly in flux. How do we also create a space that feels open, feels inviting, feels welcoming? Because so many of these institutions, including the PMA, including, all of them, all the major arts institutions across the board, not just in Philly, but beyond, have always felt like places that didn't belong to us, and then maybe even if we were extended an invitation, it would come with a price tag, that folks couldn't necessarily afford, or at least not afford to go there on the regular. And there's something about having art consistently in your life and the kind of impact that makes. It's one thing when you go to a gallery or an art space once a year. It's another thing if you kind of make that space your home away from home. And then, kind of thinking about those questions, those two questions that I sent you, the one about, how do you create space for the past, present, and future under one roof, and how might this gallery space do that for the village? And thinking about spaces where I've worked, like thinking about like, okay, like, a couple of folks that I've interviewed already have worked at history museums like AMP, you know what I mean? Like Smithsonian institutions that are more focused on the archiving and exhibition and presentation of historical artifacts, or moments in time. But then, there are also spaces that are dedicated to contemporary art and only the contemporary, like the emerging artists that are on, the front lines of whatever's happening in the art world today, and that's their main focus. And then there's folks that are thinking about the future. When you think about new media art and things that just like, are really just living in that space, how do we, kind of create a space that, are there certain tools or there's certain maybe modes of presentation or even interior design that might lend to having all these things within one space, the past, present, and future? What are your thoughts about that?
That was a big ass question, Lee.
I know.
Oh, real quick. I think that quote, "There's no culture without agriculture." I think that's attributed to Baba Malik Yakini out of D-Town Farms in Detroit, who are also doing really amazing, have been for a very long time, really amazing community work, and could be also another point of reference to help to think about, think about this process and this project.
Oh, I like that. I'm gonna need you to send me his name written down so I don't mess that up. Because no, but that's great because because as the village has a garden, you know what I mean? They're growing food on the land there. And so that is obviously still going to be a part of what they do and could be, integrated into what happens at the gallery space as well. So that's great. Yeah, I think we need to talk to more people like that.
Yes. So,
but I can simplify that question. I know.
No, it's okay. It's okay. It's okay. You know, so I was laughing as I was reading those questions, and as I'm looking again, returning back to the village's website and looking at all the work that has taken place just in this short period of time, that in the several years that I've been aware of the work that's happening. I'm like,
right,
y'all already doing it, like. But I understand that.
Right, no, but that's perfectly fine, and I think the village needs to hear that because that's exactly what Alexis said. Like, hey, you all are already doing that. That's something that you already do, and so then let me ask you this: if that's the case, what are the ways you think they have successfully achieved that? You
Well,
know,
yeah. So
what,
so I'm gonna say that's what I see from the outside looking in, right? That's
right.
what I see as someone who values art and values community, and in particular values the Black community, um, and but also someone who has not actively been participating in any of the things that have been happening there. So I know that if I were on the other side, if I was someone who worked there, someone who volunteered there, I would see it from a different perspective. I still would see probably all the wonderful things, of course, that are happening, but I also would be able to speak to some of the limitations or some of the oh, I can't think of the word, some of the impediments, or
Yeah.
see places where things didn't work in the way that it might seem like they are from the outside looking in, right? So
No, true.
um and also because I am not a part of that immediate community, right? So if we spoke to some of the members of the community, I'm sure again they would speak wonderful praises to the work that's being done, but they probably would also make some suggestions or say, hey, I wish they were doing this,
Yeah.
or I wish they were doing that, right?
Yeah.
um so I when as I was like looking at everything that I saw and all the projects that I was aware of and all of that, I was like, damn, this sounds really really amazing. And I felt like, well, what do I have to contribute?
Right.
So I mean, I feel like some of the things I'm saying are probably things that are already happening as well. But
Right.
to kind of like speak to your question, and I guess what I can imagine, I guess how I would imagine what I imagine is important for this process, and also for the outcome. And when I think outcome, I don't think of something that is necessarily fixed. I think that it is important for you know um, organizations to remain nimble, and that is not the case for a lot of organizations, especially organizations that are bound to grant funding and certain deliverables. It's really hard to to be flexible and to be responsive to the needs as they are coming up, right? But I do think it's
Right.
important to be able to anticipate that needs will always change, right?
Mhm.
Needs of the communities will always change. When I say communities, because I recognizing that there is more than one community that is going to be served, that is going to be engaging with, that is going to be a part of what's happening, at this space, this physical location, right?
Mhm.
But most importantly is always considering and always asking what those needs are, right? Um, and I think that I think a space needs to attend to the whole person, you
Mhm.
know. Um, and, you were talking about like access and the barriers to access. So when I think about I so, as a parent, and a parent to a young person in particular who you know just even thinking about my various jobs and different spaces that I've been in over the course of his 7 years of life, and
Mhm.
what I've needed as a parent, right? And there have
Right.
been a lot of times where I had to create what I needed, right? Because I needed to be in a certain place at a certain time, but I also needed to care for my child, and my child needed to be there with me. So that makes me think about, the ways in which we don't always think about caregivers or think about, people who have children. So making the space a space that is always welcoming to people and their children, or if people need to show up for a
Mhm.
meeting, or how are we supporting with childcare, or creating a space where children are welcome, first of all, because I think that's
Right.
important. I think and I think intergenerational spaces are important in a number of ways, but one, because sometimes
Mhm.
caregivers don't always have the luxury to to be able to have the children somewhere else. So how can we normalize um normalize that, like normalize, like we can
Right.
get work done, we can get work done together, and also children can be a part of that process as well, right? So they're not an
Right.
impediment to the work, but they are part of the work, and we're considering also their needs, right? um but then and making sure that they understand that like children understand like that their input, right, is valued, their creativity right, is
Right.
is valued and should be welcome into that space. Um, and of course, and then on the other, ooh, look at that, on the other end of
Girl,
it is
no, all
elders,
the
right?
time.
Right. So because what have the elders seen? What do the elders know? What can they teach us? Because we're talking about like connecting past, present, and
Right,
these potential futures, right?
exactly.
So we can't do that without knowing what has already taken place because there's a lot of lessons, right, to be learned there.
Yes.
Um, but bringing the elders in conversation with younger generations, creating projects that are having them connect with one another and talk to one another and learn from one another, right?
No, I
Um,
love that. I love what you're saying because, some people responded in terms of like the space, trying to imagine how you might organize a space so that you could hold, archives and historical exhibitions with contemporary
mhm.
alongside stuff that's futuristic and like embedded in the latest technologies. But then you're just talking about people like, they're our greatest resource, right? The community and the
Yeah.
idea that this intergenerational programming, which is, something that the village already does, like we forget that that's how we connect that, right? Through us, through
Yeah.
us and our elders, the youth, the elders, and everyone in between. Like that
Yeah.
makes so much sense.
Because I mean, that reminds me of all the like, the millions of dollars that, got spent, still are being spent to like renovate the PMA, right? To
Right.
create these visually stunning spaces that are not practical, that are not welcoming, that are not inviting, that do not consider the people who actually need to be using
Right.
the space, right? So
Right.
I mean, I think design, of course, is important. That's not my area of expertise, but
Right. Right.
but
Right.
also just like I mean, what what does it benefit a space if the space is beautiful, but then certain people can't get into the building? You know what I mean? If there are these physical barriers, even that keep people
Yeah.
out of the space, right? So I mean, taking those things into consideration. But if you're talking to people and you're talking to all different kinds of people, right?
Mhm.
You're going to get that. You're going to hear like, hey, these are the needs of our community.
Mhm.
Um, but also, I absolutely think that well, I think that what did you just say?
About archiving?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I was something else you said. Well, okay. I think that technology,
Mm.
having some space where that can be explored is really important. I mean, I think it would be explored in maybe the exhibits and the work that are being brought in by artists anyway, but um, I was watching, I don't remember the name of it, but the documentary that's out right now on Eyes on the Prize,
Oh,
right?
right. Hmm.
Which, I remember watching that. I used to rent the VHS tapes from the library and watching it.
Yeah, I think they screened that at Blackjack. You mean the documentary on the eyes?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
I remember seeing that was so powerful,
It
that film.
was. It was. I don't know
Woo.
I don't know the name of it though, but I was watching it and it was just making me think about like how important it is just to have that documentation, you know, to
Mhm.
have that record, to have the the recordings and have the interviews and
Yeah.
have all those things for posterity, right? But the importance of like documenting and also archiving that, right? Because that's another thing that I feel like we don't always have, and I hate to say like the luxury of having, but I think
Mhm.
that there's so much loss and there's so many stories that we could be learning from, you know,
Yeah.
that that have not been recorded, have not been preserved. So I think that making that something that is built in, like these things are always going to be documented, these things are always going to be archived, and allowing that archive to be contributed to by the community, right?
Mhm.
um, so that the record of what's happening in that community does not get lost, you know
Right.
and I don't know what that looks like exactly, but
Mhm.
just prioritizing that. Um,
Yeah.
and let me see. I have a question.
Yes.
Do you know that? So you know the monuments from Staying Power,
The monuments,
the the
yeah,
the
the
monument.
installations and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. Are they still up? I know the like the exhibit itself is not up, but are they still up? Are they
I
still on?
think some of them are still there because I don't think they were removed. Some were broken down, but if I'm not mistaken, I believe some are still there. Yeah.
Okay. Because I mean, I was just thinking about that as well.
Hmm.
When there's an exhibit, it goes up and it goes
Right.
down.
And then it comes down.
But
Right. And sometimes things are destroyed. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Sometimes installations, it's a one and done, and they don't, if they're not intended to travel, then they don't exist beyond the time.
sure, sure.
Um, yeah, but that's a good question because I remember I caught the tail end of it with my students. We went to see it at Moore as a part of a field trip. And then I remember them saying it was coming down. But then when I went to a meeting down the road, some of the works were, I think at least one of them was still there.
Sure.
Um, because I think they had decided that, like, they wanted it to stay. But again, we're dealing with the elements, and that's part of the thing, too. Like,
Mm-hmm.
how do we you know, how do we create works that are dealing with the times in the idea that, one of the reasons why that exhibition was really so successful at the time that it was up was because it was outdoors. I think it had wasn't always intended to be outdoors, and then the pandemic happened, and it just happened to, be like I wouldn't call it luck, but the pandemic has been anything but lucky. But the idea that folks were still able to visit it.
Sure.
I
Sure.
mean, there were so many exhibitions that really were just completely put on hold because people couldn't come into the museums,
Mm-hmm.
and the gallery spaces because of the virus. So, that's the tricky thing. And I think, people are still trying to figure that out. I don't know if you read that part about how the gallery, village, this space is intended to be indoor outdoor and like kind of be able to kind of flow with traffic, access, like making sure access is something that is clear. People aren't going to question whether this space belongs to them. They're going to know that they can enter, that there are no barriers. Like that's one of the things that is a part of the intended design for this space.
Good.
um but other things come with that too. It's like, like as far as the technology, one of the questions we were asking folks is, because when I think about that designs for different futures, I feel like, I mean, aside from like your AR, VR technology, I mean, there was a lot of stuff. I mean, there were so many like sound things and screens. And so, I mean, even from your experience with that exhibition, what do you think a space of the future, even if it's community based, community run, because like just because it's community run and community centered doesn't mean we can't have state of the art. You know what I mean? So the idea of what would, if you could have anything or, wish anything for the village, like thinking about some of the things that I witnessed as far as some of those installations. Um, I imagine things needed to be built that the PMA didn't already have, right, in order to display those things accordingly. And yeah, I mean, just the sensation. I remember just walking through and feeling like I had never seen the PMA quite look like that.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Me either.
Yeah, I mean, and I think the village is trying to consider, those same questions, like what kind of technology, what kind of um, interior design infrastructure are we going to require to be able to support artists of the future, because the artists are dreaming up some wild stuff, and it's not just, two-dimensional works on in frames on the wall,
Yeah. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
how do we accommodate.
Mm. don't know that I can answer that question only because I'm not.
No, and that's fair. And that's completely
I'm a little
fair.
analog.
You know, you're talking to
I'm just like, give me
one.
books. Just give me books.
Give me
But
books,
I
give me,
mean,
yeah.
books. I mean, that's not that don't answer your question. That is
No,
not
but you know what? You had a library though. At the Futures Therapy
yeah,
Lab, there was a great
yeah,
library. And I think that, you know, that's something that I see as a staple, like something that would
oh,
have to be in the space. You got to
yeah.
have a library, you
So
know?
I think books, you know, and I mean I think that can there's probably a number of ways that a library space can be approached, and it possibly could be nice to kind of meld the the traditional tangible physical books with some other technologies that could also be considered, but also like a library or some opportunities for folks to create and build up a library, you know what I mean, whether it be through you know oral storytelling, you know what I mean, like things that can be compiled that are a part of that library. um Ways for folks to engage with music or other, just uh, but
Different
again,
literacies, really, you
yeah,
know?
yeah, yes. See,
Yeah,
I
no.
knew you had the language.
You know what I mean? No, but I feel you because the reality is that everyone learns differently.
Yeah,
And when we talk about access, we can't just talk about physical access or even financial, you know,
yeah,
in terms of like how much we pay to get in, like, you know, what the ticket costs. But it's also about, you know, how different people choose to, or for lack of a better term, like, you know, they must engage in different ways just
yeah,
because of their own abilities, you know.
yes,
And I think that means that, like you said, it's like it could be an audio experience, it could be a written experience, it could be a tactile experience, you know. Um, but making sure that if it is about the art, you know, that we offer various opportunities for folks to engage with it, you
mm-hmm.
know. And I like the idea about not just the art, but even about learning, you know what I mean? Um, some of my favorite things, I mean, just a little sidebar anecdote is that in first grade, I'll never forget that, like, I want to say if it was Maurice Sendak, but I can't remember. It was like this audio record um, with like poetry and like learning like the alphabet and all these things. But just the fact that like we would sit down at these little tables with these little chairs and put the headphones on and we would learn through those records, you know? And I think that when I think about archives, um, for me, I love books too, but there's something for me about learning through film, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah,
and I feel that like if I'm, you know, an archive should also have videos and film, documentaries, you know
yeah,
what I mean?
yeah,
Because when it comes to the future and time, like I feel that one thing that everybody is trying to do right now is reclaim some time. You know what I mean? Time is such like a concept, and it's so fleeting, right? Like we're realizing that, you know, that's really all we got. And so how can we get more of it?
yeah,
And there's something about, you know, the idea of a film and what one can learn from a documentary, you know, and a screening experience, or even like, you know, a personal screening experience. But yeah, just thinking about different modes of learning. I love that, you know, because I think that people are thinking more and more about the digital archive, but then also, like you said, one of the things that we're trying to get people to speculate
yeah,
is that, you know, we're not just dealing with corona and this virus, but we're dealing with climate change, climate crisis,
yeah,
you know. And even Philly alone has dealt with so many things like flooding and, you know, these crazy storms and things like that that have wreaked so much havoc on artists and their studio spaces and things like that that have been damaged and whatnot. So it's just kind of thinking about how do we provide a space that is also protected against
mm,
the things we may face in the future,
yeah,
you know,
yeah,
not just about corona, but about climate change and also civil unrest. I mean, some of the things that the village was facing, when we were going through like the BLM uprising and just all these things,
Yeah.
there was a lot of chaos in the streets, and also we're dealing with increasing violence going on. And so, this space would be at the heart of the campus, the village campus, in the heart of North Philly.
Yeah.
And you already know the story, I mean, this city is really struggling right now
Yeah.
with the violence that's happening. And we want to provide a safe space, right? A welcoming space for
Mm-hmm.
all access, right? So how do you control, like, and again, it's not like I know, but these are all questions that who knows who's going to be able to answer these questions, but they're all things that we're considering. And maybe it's not so much about you providing an answer, but maybe even sharing a little bit about what your concerns might be. Like, what are some of your greatest concerns for what's going to happen for art spaces, like the ones you work in or the ones like the village in the near future, even the distant future?
Mm. When I think about when I think about spaces like the village, spaces that, to be quite honest, I don't categorize in the same way as I do a place like where I work,
Right, right.
um, because I bring myself to work, and I bring I bring the community that, but I return home to the community that I'm accountable to, right?
Right.
And I feel like the village is more like the community that I'm accountable to,
Mm.
and when I think about the concerns, I mean, and I don't have the answer, but you know we will take care of and we will protect the things that we love, the things that we feel invested in, the things that we feel we have we're bound up with, right? So I think that maintaining and also can like working to create more relationships with the folks in that community. And when I, I was asking about the monuments from Staying Power because it was just making me think about what happens when an exhibit closes, or what happens when some work comes down, or an artist in residence leaves, or whatever the case may be, right? So I was thinking about the kind of like the continuity, right, of the aftermath of a project or a program, and how how those lessons and those learnings and the challenges and all of it, how, but how does it continue to benefit the community, or how do we continue to sustain those relationships with people, and I think that making that a part, just always a part of what is being considered and always a part of the work that's being done. It does not, it doesn't, it doesn't stop life from happening. It doesn't stop the things, that are happening in the world around us from happening. But I think that just having these relationships and having caring relationships, right? Where people are looking out for one another. I
Right.
think that helps.
Because these are rare these days, unfortunately.
And if and if people see the space as their own, it makes a difference between their willingness and their desire to protect it and to care for it and to pour into it,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um yeah, I don't know.
No, I love this. And then also too, thinking about really, I think, like you said, like everyone has different expertise. And, I'm not a designer of spaces, but I use them, and as someone who's an educator, curator of programs and things like that, like, while I don't know what goes in, like the materials or the technologies and all these things, like I know what I want, like I know what I want to kind of make my thing happen. Um, and then at the same time, it's like I'm wondering, is there a way to, I don't know, like maybe build in to the conversation like for example, audiences, right? Like thinking about how you deal with community and access and the fact that some of that has been so limited now because of corona, and the idea that the protocols have shifted the way in which we experience art, and trying to figure out how we can still preserve some of these experiences that almost make the art experience what it is. Like it makes the art what it is, like especially for like theater, for example,
Yeah.
thinking about how the theater world, the performance world has suffered so much. um Music, theater, you name it, because they feed off of the audiences. Like if there is no audience to perform to perform for, then does the art change? Like what is it? What does it become when you don't have an audience there? And I feel like people were trying so hard. Like people were trying to get creative with like, well, look, you can pod up, sign up and register as a pod of people, and then we'll have so many pods that are able to attend and this and that. But like, what do you think, we might need to do as far as like even experiencing the programs you have? Can you share anything about like what you've needed to do to still keep your programs going and still serve the audience but keep them safe?
My programs have not kept going. My
Really? So
work is
you,
no, no. But some of that had to do with the the needs and the desires of the communities I was working with. They needed to kind of shift their priorities, and it
Mhm.
wasn't a priority to have us come in and do art, and that's fine. Um, you
Mhm.
know,
Mhm.
for some of the younger audiences, we made these art kits and created, some prompts and things like that. It was really beautifully done around
Mhm.
certain artworks, and then also, um, and sent those out, so they went out and they were kind of delivered. Um,
Right.
and but most of the programming that I had came to a halt, and other
Really?
than certain things going virtual, right? Um,
And that was because you were doing art making activities, like you were going on site. You were leaving the museum and going on site to these schools and whatnot. Was that what you're saying?
well, not my programs. My programs were going to places like Broad Street Ministry,
Okay. Mhm.
People's Emergency Center,
Right.
a lot of spaces that where some of the folks that they work with are experiencing, like, houselessness, or
Right.
transitional housing, things like that. Um, so it was those are the programs that stopped. The stuff that, well, actually all programs stopped for a while,
Mhm.
but the programs in the schools, that's a different department. Um,
Right.
and the way, I guess, well, just really quickly, the way that we were able to kind of reconnect with some of the younger audiences was through Parks and Rec,
Mhm.
through some of the free summer camps that the city offers. So being able to provide those art kits to the summer camps, and we sent out like teaching
Oh,
artists
okay. Okay.
occasionally. But um, I mean, I don't know, Lee. Like, I know, like, the outdoor programming, works. And you were talking about theater, and of course my mind just goes to theater and X. You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
and
Yeah.
their programming is just, well, to my knowledge, all the times I've experienced them has always been outdoors.
Right.
But I know that's not the answer to everything, because some if we're running around the year round, then what do we
Yeah.
do when it's cold outside,
What are
right?
we doing? It's like right now, like,
Yeah.
what, like folks are really missing out on those
But
experiences. Yeah.
when I think about that, and I mean, I think about, the weather is an impediment for us here in Philadelphia, where we experience multiple,
The
you know,
season.
drastically different seasons. But if we were somewhere else, and it was it just was cold most of the year. We would figure out a way to function and to operate in spite of the cold, right? So we
Mm.
can pour resources into the thing that we want to create. So there are ways to, do things outdoors where there is
Right.
free airflow, but there's also heat. You
Right.
know what I
Like
mean?
how
Like,
those restaurants have
yeah,
done what they've done. I mean, it's
yeah,
amazing how people have built literal structures on these sidewalks just to accommodate, diners that want to do their thing.
exactly.
People with the tents and the things, like people are figuring out ways to make sure that we can still do this thing and come together and have experiences,
Yes.
um, you know, not in isolation, because everyone, like, look, we appreciated the effort on Twitch and the Zooms and the DJ parties and stuff, but it was just like there's only been so many we can do of those,
Yeah.
right?
But it can be done. You know what I mean? Like that, that's where, design comes in. But I mean, again, it's a matter of like
Yeah.
putting resources into the things that are important, the things that we say we value, right?
Right.
And and getting getting the funding from the right people who
I know.
truly care, um, but also are are invested in knowing that things have to change, and things will continue to change, and being okay with that, right? But so I think investing in even design, that allows us to change and allows us to navigate the weather.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, because it can be done. We see these multi-million-dollar homes that have, that have accommodations for all sorts of things. So like the shit can be
all,
done.
all sorts of things,
Mhm.
and that's the thing too, is that, like, thinking about the skills, right? Like, in a space of the future, we imagine that as the world changes, so will our skill sets. Like, like our knowledge and our skill sets are going to have to change as well, or adapt, and evolve so that we can keep up with what's going on, and still execute, successfully. And so, thinking about a staff, right? Like, what would you think would be the essential roles of a staff of the future? Like, what would those key roles be, for folks, like, that are going to be running the show in an art space of the future?
I'm laughing because one thing I would like to see
Yeah.
is for jobs with titles like mine to not exist.
Not even, right?
uh, huh?
Right. To not even exist. Like the esteemed, so and so curator of
Community.
the.
No, no, no. Well, I mean, no, no, no. I'm talking about just like on some like community engagement, community this. Like,
Right. I see what you mean.
that's
Yeah.
bullshit. I think because
Right. Because, like,
that represents where the deficit is
I'm
throughout
about
the
to say,
entire
where there's the
community.
lack.
Yeah,
It only illuminates the lack, right?
yeah. Versus us just being people who are invested in our communities. And so
Right.
when you come to work, you show up and you work on behalf of that community.
From the
It's you
jump.
know,
Like, that's the
yeah,
goal.
like
That's,
that's what you
that's
come to do. So you
right.
don't need to have a title that is community engagement, whatever. You know
And
what I mean?
access. You're so right. And the thing is, if there was access for all, you wouldn't need a position like
Yeah.
that.
So,
You know what I mean? No, you're
but
so right.
and I saw something on the website about, oh well, no, in the email you sent me, around training folks to be art handlers and art
Hmm.
installers, you know
Right.
and I mean there's so many, you know aspects of there's so many jobs where,
Right.
we don't see our folk. It's just it's an anomaly to see. You know what I mean?
Right.
But I think about, you know, thinking about just this idea that, art and beauty as not being luxuries, right? So they're not things that only certain people with certain skill sets, certain backgrounds have access to, but instead they are just inherent to our environment, right? So that means that there are jobs. Well, first of all, what are the jobs that folks already have within the community? You know what I mean? What are the jobs that could already help to contribute to, what's going on, like who are the carpenters and who are the electricians, and like
Right.
the people who do the most like
Right.
foundational work to get this shit up and running, right? But and how can they, teach other people,
Yeah.
or also how can their work, if they're interested in it being that, be expanded? You know what I mean? How can they learn how to apply those skills in an art setting?
Right.
Um, but thinking about just like the quote unquote like traditional like museum gallery roles, right? There's like curators and directors
Hmm.
and
Right.
and educators and things like that. Um, I think, and we know just like how those all of those positions are, you know, assigned to certain people with certain backgrounds, and
This is true.
like the ex we there's so much expertise,
Hmm.
and the fact that we have to bring in, people to talk about certain subject matter because there's nobody on staff to speak to that particular thing. Like I'm
Hmm.
just thinking about, the only people that are experts, in the community are the people who are there in the community, right? The people who are there, in relationship with other people and living alongside folk. So I don't know that I almost want to discard those titles because
Yeah.
they they make us think something else, even when we, because like even when we're like, oh, you're a community curator. And
Right.
I mean,
Right.
sure, right? I mean, sure, that's a thing, that can be a thing.
Right.
But I feel like it still assigns this level of like superiority, you
Hmm.
know,
Hmm.
versus like we just figure out who wants to do the thing,
Yeah.
and figure out how to get them the resources, or connect, what I mean, like, or just get people in conversation so they can work on these things together.
Right.
um yeah, I don't know exactly like what that looks like, but I feel like not necessarily trying to model ourselves after this thing that already exists, that we know is already harmful and we know is not working,
Right.
and doesn't necessarily benefit us.
Right. Like trying something completely different. Like someone suggested, especially when we're dealing with all these crises, and there's always someone putting out a statement. It's almost like you need like like a crisis person, like someone like a first responder type of person, right? That
Mm-hmm.
might deal with, writing those emails to the public to alert them of what the protocols will be given this latest emergency or this latest threat that we as a community have to face, but yet deal with and live with, you know what I mean? And how we're going to navigate around that. Because there's usually a public statement around that. And then there's also things that usually happen internally, and when you have a large staff, sure, there might be somebody in security or something that's handling that. That might be the person that kind of wears that other hat and kind of has to deal with the crisis, but might not be trained to do so. But I do feel like, when a storage unit floods, or when you've got, I don't know, protesters on your steps or something, and like there's just all kinds of things that could happen, that I feel like when you have an art space at the heart of a community, and
Mm-hmm.
at the heart of a community that has already been dealing with so much, like I said, from the civil unrest to the climate change to the pandemic and you name it, you know, some folks are thinking about whether it might be a resident therapist, like art therapist, or someone who might be able to respond to crises, But it just
Yeah.
seems that we're going to have to expand our understanding of roles
Yeah.
that are essential
Mm-hmm.
for an art space that's going to be doing so much, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, the art handlers, yeah, like, that's just one job that the village is thinking that they want to train youth to take on this new thing, which is rare. You don't see too many art handlers of color in the art world, but that's a good place to start. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? It doesn't mean that, of course, there's so many other roles, but a good place to start.
I think wellness, the wellness of staff, and
Yeah.
also, people who are able to respond to the needs of the community. I think that's essential. I think that is really important.
Yeah.
Um,
Like a creative problem solver, like someone,
mhm,
like you said, who's from the community, embedded in the community, knows the community, and when things come up,
yeah.
can immediately address the needs in a way that is sensitive and empathetic and effective, right?
But I think also, you know, because if you just let's just assume there's one person, that's a
Right.
lot on one person,
It
right?
is,
And what
isn't it?
I think in addition to that is to have strategies and programs and things that are things that become ritual or a part of practice that are already built into how the space is functioning so that
Mhm.
people have other resources besides that one person. You know, I mean, so in addition to having like a list of resources or, some place where they can find resources, right? But also like what are the things that just keep us well on a daily basis? You know what I mean? So like
We do. We need that.
how is that also kind of like woven into the fabric of what this space is so
Mhm.
that people have some of those tools so that everything is not an emergency then they go to this one person who then at some
Right.
point becomes overwhelmed with you know things that are their job and then things that seemingly aren't. So
Right.
I
Right.
think like a just this culture of wellness as well, I think is really in taking care of ourselves because that you know
Hmm.
it sounds good to talk all that
I
self-care
know.
with you, but at the same time if you have more emergent things happening then of course taking care of yourself is not going to be at the top of the list. So how, you know what I mean? So like what
Right.
are the strategies and the practices and the tools that can be practiced on a regular basis?
On a regular basis, like making it integral, like not just like necessarily responsive in the moment,
Yeah.
and like a one time, like you said, answer to an issue, but
Yeah.
something that is integrated within the practice and the daily, like just basically the foundation of the place is
Yeah.
what it is. Because also too, one of the things that came up is this idea of one of the ways that we take care of ourselves is honoring our grief and our loss. And so many of us have lost so many during this time. And one of the things is thinking about how the village has always held space for honoring ancestors and sacred space for healing. And
Sure.
so that has usually been fulfilled through the sacred gardens that they have, the outdoor gardens, but thinking about how they might create a dedicated space within the gallery or the art space that we're talking about now that could, um, house some sort of altar or community, prayer space, that, could be for meditation or what have you. But yeah, just thinking about healing, like on the regular, like
Yeah.
not just every time something happens, but just daily healing,
Yeah.
a daily healing practice that folks can go and find peace, within the walls of this space, as well as outdoors, which is something the village has already offered. Um, but then, like, I guess in conclusion, because I know we want to wrap things up, but one of the questions that I've been asking folks is really about, how they might speculate what the world is going to be like. Because one of the things we're trying to think about is like, there's so many different ways that science fiction, Afrofuturism, like, just the world of the imagination through storytelling, whether the gaming world, literature, film, what have you, has depicted the not so distant future and also the far off future, but even just the not so distant, because again, even when you think about 30 years ago, what was it, the 90s or something? You know what I mean? And like I remember what I was doing in the 90s. I don't
You
know if you
said
remember.
30 years. I was like, wait, the 60s? No.
I know. That's what I was gonna do, but no, it was just the 90s. I was about to do that. I was about to, because when I was trying to calculate, I was like, oh, that's the 70s. I'm like, no, we're in 2022. Okay. So that's the 90s. And I'm just like, wow, but
Yeah.
when was the internet invented? Like, the idea of cell phones and internet and this and that, things
Mhm.
that we can't even imagine our life without at this point,
Yeah.
what is it going to be like 30 years from now? And how can we kind of future proof a space, of thinking like, and one way is we future proof a space and make sure that it is sustainable and functional and successful even down the line, like years down the line, is using our imaginations to
Mm-hmm.
speculate what the future worlds might look like. And
Mm-hmm.
so of all like the stories,
Mm-hmm.
that you know of, I mean, I could name up a few because, for example, some folks have said, okay, I Am Legend, right? Like that was the film with the zombies, Will Smith and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
That was kind of like taking place during the now. 20 Blade Runner, that's a very futuristic tech cyber punk reality that took place in like the 2040s or something like that, around then. I mean, and that's not that long from now. And then I'm pretty sure that Octavia Butler's Parable Sower, that was like 2025 or something like that.
Yeah.
So that was like now, you know, and
Mm-hmm.
that world did not look cool. Nobody wants to go there,
They
nobody,
all are scary.
no, thank you. But we're getting close to it.
Yeah.
And so just thinking about like, because then I think about it like, Lauren Olamina was not going to visit the gallery. You know what I mean? She wasn't going to go into the museum,
See,
during that time.
all those things that you described and the things that so many of the things that I've seen in like, you know, popular culture and, things like that, they all reference this really like desolate, you know, these desolate spaces. And I mean, and even though it looks like that outside right now to some degree, but
Right?
like
I know.
we are moving in that direction. But I think because we're in the moment, we can't see we don't see the starkness, you know what I mean,
Right.
between what's
Right.
depicted in some of those films. But, but I guess the thing that concerns me, I mean, I think is, you know, lack of access to resources and how quickly, I mean, even just in the beginning of the pandemic, how quickly like things just dried up, you know,
Yeah. Like the
and
resources,
just
the
how quickly
funding.
we didn't have access to things that we take for granted, right?
Mhm.
Um, which shows, how bad it would be if things really, if something
Toilet
really,
paper.
yeah, yeah, and so that, and then also the way that we relate to one another, you know what I mean? Like the way that, you know, I mean, we see so much care. We see so many ways that people have shown care for one another in these really difficult times, but also the ways that other people have shown so much disconnection and so much lack of care. So, I mean, I see. Gosh, I don't know. So when I think about the future, and I mean, we're here in some ways,
Right.
but I think human connection is so important,
Yeah.
because again, when I was saying like, well, if people, they care about some shit, they'll protect it. But like, I think that us being in relationship with one another, but also understanding the importance of like land, and not like, oh, go get some land. I mean, that would be great, right? If we all
Right.
had access to land and things like that. But like, how do we, what are the connections that we have with one another so that when we are in need, you know, we can come together and support one another.
Mhm.
Um, and I think it's just really scary to think of lack, how much lack there is, and just how much, you know, how much we have, how much abundance there is, but also how
Right.
much, you know, the inaccessibility of some of that abundance, and just um, how we can, I don't want to say respond to that, but like how we can prepare
Mhm.
ourselves to be better prepared for, you know, when things change. So how we can
Right. And for
figure out,
scarcity.
yeah,
Yeah.
scarcity, and how we can just better support one another. I don't know if that answers your question,
No,
but
but it does because, I mean, like you're right. I mean, and that's the comment that just keeps coming up, that like so many of the futures that we see in these films and these movies, like, the books and stuff, it's all dystopian, not a lot of these creators and world builders are creating stories that speak to utopia, or even something that's brighter than, like you said, total wasteland
Yeah.
devastation, like,
Yeah, and I don't imagine. I mean, I'm not imagining even. I mean, even a utopia, but just because I think like those dystopian like stories, it's always like, okay, scarcity, so we grab at and we hoard, and then because we have to make sure we have enough for us, right? But like, I guess what I'm trying to get at is like in envisioning something different, and envisioning what does it look like if we're thinking about us, all of us,
yeah,
not
yeah.
me, not me and mine, but like if we're thinking about all of us and what might our needs be. And I don't know what that is. You know what I
Well,
mean?
yeah.
But
Well, the scary part is this is that unfortunately what this pandemic has taught us, just in the way that people respond to simple things like wearing masks or getting vaccinated, I mean, everyone has their own reasons, but it just seems like the idea of the collective good or collective wellness is a concept that is really out of reach for a lot of people. It's hard for them to grasp
yeah.
it. And that's why I think I have so much concern about the future, and why the dystopian reality that is projected in these stories of the not so distant future feels so real and close to
Mm,
what might be, because,
yeah.
it just seems like the attitude, and just, and that's why, creating spaces like, the space of the village is planning for right now, is a part of that assurance that there will be some places we can go, where people have these values, where they are thinking about the collective, where they are thinking about their neighbors' wellness, not just their own. They are thinking about how will my neighbor eat, how can I support others who don't have, how can they share, like these are all things that I think people um aren't too familiar with anymore, or even, the idea of that somehow it scares them, and people are just, it's hard. So I'm with you. I think you're right on point with this idea of what we're battling with in terms of scarcity, and thinking about how um we might work towards trying to change that and trying to shift that narrative.
Yeah.
But it
And that's
takes a
why
lot.
we need to talk to our elders because they've been here before.
I know, and which comes right, bringing it back to Sankofa and that whole idea, and like you said, which is that first thing we talked about at the beginning of this hour, just like the idea of, how we create a space that is considering past, present, and future, and allows for that synergy of all those things to exist, is this intergenerational piece, and really tapping into the elders for the wisdom that they possess, because they've seen things our eyes like can't even imagine.
Hmm.
And the fact that, like, yeah, when I think about, because my mom used to talk about my grandma who was alive when, I think, before planes were flying or something. You know what I mean? So it's just like, what's going to be our thing to where this is our reality, but like we wouldn't have even have been able to imagine where
Yeah.
we're going. And I don't know if Octavia was right about us, going to the moon, going to the stars. I feel like I won't be one of those people, Shivon. I won't. I'm gonna stay right here. And I'm gonna wave goodbye to those of you who are able to take that journey, but I'm not. I'm cool. I'm cool with spaceships and stuff. I'm not even comfortable with riding on elevators. It's true. I'm a little claustrophobic, a little fear of heights. But anyway, this last question is actually off the record. Like, it's not going to be recorded or shared publicly. But I've just been asking everyone I'm interviewing, like, if there's anyone else that you might think about, that might be good for me to interview in the second round of this.
Hmm.
That, and it can be from any field. They don't have to be within the arts, because, like you said, the world of food and agriculture connect to this project as well.
If they're not already on your list, Ashley Gripper.
What? Ashley should have been on my list. Yes. Yes, 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 yes. Okay, right on, right on. Ashley Gripper, right on. I've been meaning to holler at Ashley anyhow. That's great. That's a great suggestion. Thank you very much.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I think she can have a lot of insight. great insight into this conversation.
Yes, indeed, indeed. Okay, cool. So I will be following up with I don't know if you already have like a 2022 W-9, but if you don't have a form, I can forward it. I
Okay.
think either myself or I can't remember, but I might either be connecting you with the folks from the village, most likely Jeanette. I don't know if you know Jeanette. Um,
I think so.
but Jeanette is the project specialist. I forget her title too, but she does all the things and she's
Okay.
amazing. But she's going to be helping me with getting people's payments processed. But um, yeah, and then other than that, I'll be following up in general because once we decide how we're going to present this information, because our
Hmm.
goal is to also share this with the village community,
Sure.
because again, this research will be applied to their shaping of this, design for the gallery.
Hmm.
And so we're also wanting to share this information with the more general public so that they
Hmm.
can kind of see how we got from point A to B.
Okay.
Um, and, folks might have ideas on how we might do that. We're thinking about, it could be a poster series or animation, who knows, but we're
Hmm.
trying to figure it all out. But I thank you so much for doing this on, and I just gotta ask you, why is it still sunny? It's dark as heck, and why are you still have light coming in from the windows? What part are you facing? What you facing east? You must be facing west.
West. Yeah. Yeah. West. West. Yes.
Yeah, because I'm like I'm in the dark, and you're just like, oh,
The
that sun's
window.
still shining.
I'm facing Fairmount Park, and the windows are a little generous, so
Okay, yeah,
which I appreciate. I
that natural light. I know, because that keeps our spirits up in times like
Hmm.
this. Indeed. Well, look, thank you so much, and I'll be seeing you Wednesday
No, what is Wednesday?
for the AAC meeting.
Oh yes, I will see you Wednesday. Okay.
Bye. Have a good night.
Bye. All
Thanks so
right.
much. See you.